Jeff Nippard just dropped his 100-day experiment video on training with low volumes. Let's see whether his take on volume for hypertrophy holds up and which takes I agree with or disagree with. I've conducted research on volume myself and I've read the literature very closely.
Size down to just one all-out set, sometimes two. Would I lose muscle?
Well, in this video, I'll break down exactly what I did, what the science says, and what happened to my physique.
For as long as I've been training, I've always been a pretty high volume guy. For one, that's the way the bodybuilding greats like Arnold, Ronnie Coleman, and Jay Cutler all trained, and it's also what the science suggested was most optimal. So for me, it was kind of a no-brainer. I generally do at least 3 to 4 sets on each and every exercise, every workout. But like I said, for the last 100 days, I flipped that completely. I became the lowest volume guy in the gym. Instead of 3 to 4 sets, I only did 1 or 2 sets per exercise. That's it. For several lifts, I just do one all-out max effort set and move on.
God. Oh, man. Now, to get everyone on the same page, when I say volume, I mean the total number of hard working sets that you do for a muscle each week.
First off, I love this definition, especially compared to the older volume definition that went by volume load, sets times reps times weight. And believe it or not, that was the prevailing definition in exercise science and even in the gym until just a few years ago. Alongside an article on the topic by Stronger by Science, Basval and colleagues published a paper arguing that for hypertrophy training, volume should really be quantified as individual hard sets, no matter the rep range. And that's because we had solid evidence suggesting that the weight and rep range combination you use didn't really matter as far as hypertrophy went. And so you could leave those two terms out of that volume load equation entirely and still get something predictive of a hypertrophy. The best way to really count volume is individual hard sets, and provided you're somewhere between 5 to maybe even 50 reps per set, close to failure, that is volume.
You're doing a high volume program. If you do a small number of sets, you're doing a low volume program.
So let's use our chest as an example. Let's say you hit your chest on 2 days, 3 sets of chest press on Monday and 3 sets of cable flies on Thursday, and that's all you do for the week. That means your weekly chest volume is 6 sets per week. And for the last decade or so, the standard science-based guideline for sets per muscle per week was, what do you think? It's about 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week. That's quite a lot. Going with our chest example, the low end of the science-based range at 10 sets would look like this. 3 sets of chest press plus 3 sets of cable flies on Monday and 4 sets of push-ups on Thursday. And the high end of the science-based range at 20 sets would look like this. 4 sets of chest press and 4 sets of cable flies on Monday, 3 sets of push-ups and 3 sets of pec deck on Wednesday, 3 sets of incline press and 3 sets of dumbbell flies on Friday. That's a lot of chest, and that doesn't include warm-up sets.
Jeff's doing a great job here of conveying what the overall consensus was at the time. This is absolutely how most evidence-based lifters thought about it, myself included. But it is worth noting that in one of the studies Jeff just cited, they did compare 12 to 20 sets to 20 plus sets, and all effect sizes for triceps, biceps, and quads did favor 20 plus sets. And while some of these effects weren't statistically significant, they did hint at the possibility of there being a benefit in favor of 20 plus sets, especially with how consistent that effect was across different muscle groups. In fact, just last year, I reviewed all the research on 20 plus sets versus under 20 sets and found that out of 8 studies on the topic, 4 had found a benefit in favor of 20 plus sets and 4 had found similar hypertrophy. But fortunately for us, there's been more research since then, so let's keep watching.
These are all hard working sets all the way to failure or very close to it. And of course, that's just for one muscle. For your total body volume, you need to add up all the sets for all your other muscles too. Those are some long workouts. Trust me, I trained like this for years, but not anymore. This is what my full week of chest training looks like now. 2 sets of incline press and 2 sets of pec deck on Monday, 2 sets of machine chest press on Thursday. That's it, 6 sets per week. Let's use this graph to compare how my current volumes look compared to the standard science-based volumes. This is what the high end of the science range looks like, and this is what the low end of the science range looks like. And this is what I'm doing right now. So it's pretty freaking low across the board.
Most of my muscles get 6 sets per week. Some get 4 sets per week, and a few are in the 8 to 10 range. My shoulders get 10 sets, my back gets 9, my glutes get 9, and my quads get 8. On average, I'm only doing about 6.5 sets per muscle per week.
And for the 100-day experiment, I split that volume up like this. Upper, lower, rest, upper, lower, arms, rest. And I repeated that split for 14 weeks.
The thing is, on paper, by following this plan, I was training at a level of volume that most experts would say is too low to maximize muscle growth.
For the past 15 years, the research has been hammering the same message. Volume is king. Back in 2010, James Krieger published a meta-analysis of 8 studies comparing 1 set versus 2 to 3 sets per exercise. And what he found was clear. Doing more sets caused more gains. 2 to 3 sets per exercise was about 40% more effective than just doing 1 set. And over the next 6 years, at least another 7 studies on volume and hypertrophy were published. So in 2016, Krieger and colleagues dropped another meta-analysis. This time, rather than sets per exercise, they looked at sets per muscle per week, and they found a clear dose-response effect. Once again, more volume meant more gains.
Quick note that in this meta-analysis, which is older by Schoenfeld and colleagues, the highest category was only 10 plus sets. In other words, we didn't really have enough evidence above 10 sets per week per muscle group to be able to tell what volume was best. Things have really changed since then.
By this point, volume had pretty much cemented itself as the main driver of hypertrophy within the science-based community. I was even singing its praises. Training volume, this has been cited as being the main driver of hypertrophy. But were we all kind of wrong?
Well, last year, Pelland and colleagues dropped the biggest, most detailed meta-analysis on training volume that's ever been published by far. Now, we're up from 15 to, get this, 35 studies on training volume for muscle growth.
And this time, they found another super clear dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy. More volume, more gains. And that trend held from as low as 4 sets per muscle per week all the way up to 43 sets per muscle per week. Even the authors were kind of like, man, I don't know what to tell you. Doing a lot of volume just really seems to work.
Completely agree with Jeff here. At this point, one of the things we have the most evidence for in all of lifting is that doing more volume will generally lead to more hypertrophy, provided you can recover from it. What does recovery mean? Well, recovery means looking at your training performance in the gym and seeing whether week upon week your performance is similar or improving. Let's say you can usually bench 225 for 10. If you go in next week and you can only bench 225 for 9 with your best effort, chances are you didn't recover. However, if you're able to do at least 10 reps, say 10, 11 or more, then you did recover. And there's a good chance that you would benefit from more volume because your recovery capacity allows for it.
There are some issues. If you venture deep into the dingy underground corners of the online science-based lifting subculture, you'll find plenty of people criticizing this paper. You'll hear that none of these studies are actually measuring true muscle growth. What's really happening is all that high volume training is simply causing the muscle to swell up with blood and inflammation, something called edema. It's really just a big pump that lasts a few days, making it look like the subjects gained more muscle when the researchers measured it. There's probably some truth to this, but it's not the angle I'm taking. I think the overall effect is just too big across too many studies. It's more than just edema gains. Plus, the authors address this in the paper itself.
Absolutely agree with Jeff here. The relationship between volume and hypertrophy is simply too consistent to explain away with a potential confounding issue like edema or swelling. I'm not going to go super in depth here because there's a great article by Strong by Science that actually covers the edema and swelling issue altogether, but I'll summarize what it says. Most studies that find substantial swelling after a workout are in the context of a single workout being performed once. In other words, your body has never experienced that stimulus before. In the context of repeating a similar or the same workout over and over again, the edema or swelling response tends to diminish quite drastically. In a vacuum, the training that tends to produce the largest muscle swelling response is eccentric contractions performed for high volumes, close to failure, with high tension, ideally. And indeed, when you look at studies that use that sort of workout once, substantial swelling is observed, sometimes for as long as 3 to 7 days after the workout. And yeah, if you're measuring hypertrophy 3 days after the last workout in a study, you could therefore argue that edema or swelling are impacting your final hypertrophy change measurement. And although there isn't much research on this, studies that repeat the same workout time and time again, even highly damaging workouts that would cause muscle swelling, observe a starkly diminished swelling response. For example, a 2021 study by Margaret Ellis and colleagues. In this study, 2 groups performed 1 quad training session once a week. One group performed only concentric contractions for 5 sets of 15 reps. The other group only eccentric contractions, highly damaging, for 5 sets of 15 reps. In both cases, an isokinetic dynamometer was used. That is a machine where effectively you're constantly pushing as hard as you possibly can. The machine will only move at a fixed speed. You just have to contract as hard as humanly possible. Having conducted research with this sort of device myself, I can tell you, it is brutal and it will cause more muscle swelling than any other form of traditional training. However, they assessed a variety of other markers of muscle damage. And as you'd expect, when participants first performed these pretty challenging workouts, they experienced substantial soreness and muscle damage. However, by week 10, the difference between concentric and eccentric groups was minimal, and neither group really experienced much muscle damage at all. So when it comes to much less damaging training, like the sort of training you're likely to do in the gym, no eccentric overload, no maximum contractions, simply because free weights and machines generally don't allow for it, it is very unlikely that you're experiencing much swelling after 8 weeks of doing the same workout over and over. And that is also why in studies lasting 8 to 12 weeks of the same exact workout being repeated, it is unlikely that muscle swelling is responsible for the increased hypertrophy we see from higher volumes. But let's move on.
A much more practical lens. First, let's get this straight. These studies didn't apply high volumes to every muscle all at once. No, most of them just blasted their biceps and triceps or their quads with high volumes. And for the most part, all their other muscles were trained normally or not at all. So the best you can really say is that high volume works if you blast a single muscle or two. Even the authors note that doing high volume for your entire body could cause some serious recovery issues. And speaking of recovery, almost all of these studies were done at around maintenance calories.
Jeff has a great point here. Most of the studies we have on high volumes do involve just training one or maybe two muscle groups really hard with super high volumes. Oftentimes, the researchers don't even have participants train any other muscles. Or when we do, as in some studies I've been involved with, we usually keep that training pretty easy and just enough to keep them on program during the study. So there is a bit of a question mark there. But with that being said, we do have a few studies where people were doing pretty close to 200 total sets across the training week and still benefited.
What happens if you're in a caloric deficit like I am right now? A deficit means less energy, which means less recovery. So it's just not clear if these results apply when you're cutting. This is a crucial point that I'll come back to when I show you my fat loss results throughout this low volume experiment.
What Jeff is saying here could be true. It could be that during a deficit, your recovery takes a hit, and that therefore, you're actually better off doing lower volumes than usual. So that relationship we observe between volume and hypertrophy at maintenance or in a surplus is a different shape during a deficit. And that could be true. Equally though, the relationship between training volume and hypertrophy has been shown to be robust to a variety of things. Rest times, training to failure or not, how long the study is. And we just have a lot of studies generally showing that more volume leads to more growth. And while we don't have research directly on training volume during a cut, we do have plenty of research on people training in a cut. And with a deficit, all we generally observe is that the magnitude of growth is lowered. But there's not really a compelling reason at this stage, based on the research, that there could be such a thing as too much volume categorically. Now, is there such a thing as too much overall training volume? When it comes to the individual, yes. It's very possible that you could overdo it, but the way you figure that out is by looking at your performance week to week to evaluate recovery and adjust volume accordingly. But from the research at least, this claim doesn't really have much backing. Pay attention to your performance.
Perhaps most importantly though, all of these studies are short-term interventions. They usually only last 6 to 12 weeks. So what happens over a longer time frame, like a year or two? Do higher volumes keep pulling you ahead forever? Or do they just give you a short-term boost and lower volume training would eventually catch up as you get closer and closer to your natural limit? Based on this research, we can't really say because they don't last long enough. And then there's this whole thing with diminishing returns in general.
This is a great point by Jeff, that most research just doesn't last that long. And so we have kind of a question mark over what happens much past 12, 15, 20 weeks. However, if in the long run, high volumes actually weren't beneficial anymore, maybe there's a benefit to lower volumes, if that were true, we would expect shorter-term studies to generally find more of a benefit to higher volumes, with longer studies finding less of a benefit. And yet, we see the opposite. Pell and colleagues actually performed a subgroup analysis by study duration to see whether the relationship would change in any way going from shorter studies to longer studies, and it didn't. And it's unlikely that past around 15 weeks, that relationship between volume and hypertrophy just suddenly flips.
On the surface, all these studies can definitely make it feel like doing exponentially more volume will get you exponentially more gains, but that isn't how it works at all. The extra muscle growth that you get by doing more and more volume gets smaller and smaller. All of that is why.
This is absolutely true, and I fully agree with Jeff here. For many people, the bang for buck of spending more time in the gym, hammering more and more volume, just isn't really worth it. As a rough heuristic from the Pell meta-analysis, based on the model fit, doubling your volume usually gets you around 50% more growth. If you were going to gain an inch on your arms with 10 sets per week for your biceps and triceps, going to 20 sets a week for your biceps and triceps might get you around 1.5 inches, so 50% more relative growth. That's double the time in the gym for only 50% more relative growth. And that gets worse and worse as you do more and more sets.
Was I doing all this volume just based on some bodybuilding anecdotes from guys 100 pounds bigger than me and some science that, while valid, has some serious practical limitations? My N=1 experiment lasted for 100 days, which is longer than almost all of these studies I've shown you so far. I tracked my chest strength and my quad strength using a standardized science-based protocol. I tracked my physique with progress photos under the exact same lighting, and I tracked my body fat and lean mass with DEXA.
I know Jeff will mention this a ton in the video because he always gives good disclaimers, but this is definitely an N=1 experiment. And compared to the meta-analysis he mentioned several times already by Paladin and colleagues, this should not be viewed as basically any evidence beyond maybe he enjoyed it. Maybe he found it fun, but it's not really adding any more evidence to either side of the argument.
For the challenge, I wrote the most effective low volume split I could think of. Upper, lower, rest, upper, lower, arms and delts, rest. In just 1 to 2 sets per exercise, with almost every set taken to failure. I knew from other research that if I was going low on volume, I needed to go ultra high on intensity. Oh, come on, yeah! Nice, dude. We got a little cheaty at the end, but I'm gonna count it. Ooh. Oh, man. I love this machine. Now, I'll be honest, I did have some doubts, especially in those first few weeks. After years and years of doing 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week, it did feel like I wasn't doing enough. But by around week 3, I noticed something surprising. Not only was I not losing size, I actually looked harder and fuller. I was noticing more vascularity too. That's probably because I was getting leaner, but the lower volume training was still keeping my muscles fuller than what I expected.
I don't think there's really much meaning to saying you look fuller or drier at this stage. Not to discount his practical experience as far as enjoyment or general practicality, but when it comes to things like the muscle feeling fuller or looking fuller, I really wouldn't read into this at all. We know that swelling probably isn't a big effect when it comes to low versus high volume training regardless. And as long as you're doing some training to facilitate glycogen replenishment or maintenance, you're probably not going to notice anything that will visually outdo the effect of cutting, which incidentally is what Jeff is doing here. He's lost a ton of weight and he's looking amazing.
And most importantly to me, despite steadily losing weight, I was keeping my strength up on all my lifts. And that's probably the best indicator that I was keeping my muscle.
Great point by Jeff here that your performance during a cut can be a pretty good metric of whether or not you're maintaining your muscle. But I want to give a quick caveat based on the research. A meta-regression by Murphy et al. Looked at all the studies on losing weight while also lifting weights. And they looked at both the effect of cutting on strength and hypertrophy separately. And the relationship appears divergent. Additionally, for performance in the gym to be a decent indicator of your muscle retention, technique, exercise order, and everything else has to be standardized for it to be indicative.
After the first month was up, I started to think that maybe I just didn't need as much volume as I used to think, as long as I was pushing really hard. The research does show, for the most part, that on average, higher volume training does lead to more muscle growth. However, I do think on a cut, a low volume program can make more sense, and that's because you have a lower recovery capacity. And so a high volume training program can just be harder to recover from. So yeah, if you're doing a bulk or a recomp or whatever, high volume training works great. I think it makes perfect sense. But when you're on a cut, I think a lower volume program with really high intensity is a smarter approach. And that's what we're doing.
So there could absolutely be some merit to this idea. Because your recovery is worse in a cut, you would benefit from lower training volume than in a maintenance or in a surplus phase. However, there's really not any evidence to support this notion yet. This is absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence. And yes, super low energy intakes can hamper hormonal profiles and recovery, but this statement largely just lacks evidence at this stage. A better way to think of the relationship between volume and growth in a cut versus in a bulk is probably simply a downward shift of the curve. This is also speculative, but it comports much better with what we actually see in practice. Making gains is simply harder in a cut. Recovery does sometimes still take a small hit, but by and large, people can still recover from pretty high training volumes, and it's really difficult to overtrain in a cut. But as always, pay attention to your performance.
1 month isn't that much to go by, and new programs are always fun at first anyway. Plus, if it turns out that I lose a bunch of muscle by the 100-day check-in, I might change my tune. By the midway point, I started to feel like all that extra volume that I used to do was depleting me more than I realized. I actually think it was holding me back in some ways, because training is supposed to be fun. And I'll tell you, I used to dread doing some of those super high volume workouts, especially leg days, and especially when cutting. Nowadays, for my leg workout, I hit 2 sets of squats, 2 sets of leg curls, 1 set of lunges, 2 sets of leg extensions, 1 set of abductions, and 2 sets of calves. It's not nothing, it's still a hard workout, but it only takes me about 45, maybe 60 minutes if I take my time, and I absolutely love it. I'm also more locked in than ever before. I don't know if it's some of my ADHD tendencies, but during almost every single high volume workout I used to do, my focus would always start to taper off near the middle. I'd go on my phone more, I'd rest a little longer in between sets, and just start socializing. An already long workout would drag on even more. And this is where a low volume training style really shines. It's what I've been calling the focus effect. When you know you only have 1 or 2 sets to get the job done, you will lock in. Before every set, I remind myself that I need to nail my execution and my effort. And because of that, I don't think there's been a single set where I didn't bring the intensity for this entire challenge.
I think this is a great point, and this is really fair. If you're kind of in a rut with your training and you feel like you're sandbagging many sets, I think there's something to that low volume approach. If you're dreading training. That said, from my personal experience and from my coaching experience, I think there's something to changing your program in any way when it comes to attenuating that dread that you feel. And there's ways to do that that don't compromise stimulus. A different training routine, different exercises, different rep ranges, just switching things up. Why compromise a variable we have really solid evidence for when you don't have to, when there are other ways to change your program? As a side note, one way to make leg days easier is to just not do them. And hear me out here. Instead of doing your leg day, which takes a long time, is grueling, and you kind of space out in the middle, just take that volume and spread it out across the week. 1 to 2 lower body exercises per day on every full body session gets you a similar amount of volume, but is way more manageable.
And even if they are amazing, you shouldn't base too much of your own training off of one person's experience.
100% agree with Jeff here, and I love that he's highlighting this and that he's still pointing at the research fundamentally. Awesome work.
At the science. Because while on the surface, it really can look like volume is king, there is more support for a lower volume training approach than you'd think, at least in the right context. For example, there's a lot of data showing that you need way less volume to maintain muscle than you need to build muscle. This classic study from Bickel and colleagues had subjects run 2 phases back to back, a high volume phase and a low volume phase. For the high volume phase, they hit their legs 3 days a week. Each workout had 3 sets of squats, 3 sets of leg press, and 3 sets of leg extensions. That's 27 sets per week just for their quads. And they did that for 16 weeks. Then, half the subjects entered a super low volume phase, where they dropped their workload down to, get this, 1 set for each exercise once a week. That means they went from 27 sets down to 3. And guess what happened to their gains? They maintained 100% of their size and strength for another 16 weeks. Oh, and then another 16 weeks after that. They maintained their gains for 32 weeks. That's 224 days, doing just 1 set per exercise, 3 sets total a week. That's it. And there were 70 subjects in that study. Some of them actually kept making gains during the low volume phase.
And to really drive this home, a brand new low volume study from September of this year, so just last month, was just published. In this paper,
Hey, that's our study. That came out from Brad Schoenfeld's lab. Shout out to Tommy Herman, the lead researcher, for doing a lot of the work on this. Awesome study.
and colleagues had 42 resistance-trained subjects run a low-volume program, 2 full-body workouts per week with just 1 set per exercise. Each workout took about 30 minutes. They split everyone doing that low-volume program into a failure group and a non-failure group. The failure group, obviously, went to failure. The non-failure group left 2 reps in reserve. Other than that, both groups were following that 30-minute workout twice a week low-volume plan. And after 8 weeks of 1 set per exercise per workout, both groups made significant gains. The failure group tended to grow better overall, though. So this new study tells us 2 really important things. First, on a low-volume program, going to failure seems to work better. And perhaps more importantly, it tells us that even experienced trainees can make gains on a low volume program.
Volume might not be the king that we thought. At least that's what I make of this 2023 meta-analysis from Robinson and colleagues, which very clearly showed that the closer you train to failure, the more muscle you gain. To me, if any one variable should wear the crown, it should probably be training hard, right?
I can't help but notice that length and partials isn't on this list of the most important variables. And let's be honest, we know who the real king is. Jokes aside though, here are some thoughts. First, the findings from both of those studies, being able to maintain at just 3 sets a week, and our study finding that just a few sets a week to failure was enough to make gains even in trained lifters, especially when the sets were taken to failure. Those findings comport really well with the meta-analysis by Pellin and colleagues, who found that on average, when at calorie maintenance, around 3 to 4 weekly fractional sets was sufficient to maintain muscle size. I do think that proximity to failure is one of the kings, in as much as it doesn't take any extra time to take a set close to failure, or even ideally, in my opinion, beyond failure. However, what I think Jeff is doing here is a slight false dichotomy, and it is speculative, in that I think both volume and training to failure are king. However, we do have the research to say that both are really damn important, both training to failure and potentially beyond failure, based on some of the research from my lab, and training with really high volumes seems to boost hypertrophy, and that trend is consistent across several dozen studies. Crowning just one king here is probably doing a disservice to the other variable. Maybe eventually we'll know that one is actually more important, but for the time being, we just don't.
And with low volume training, since you're only doing a small handful of sets, you can't afford to push nearly every single set to failure without hurting your recovery. If you try to do that on a higher volume plan, the fatigue and injury risk would eventually start to outweigh any marginal benefits.
I agree that especially with lower volume training programs, you can afford to push proximity to failure a bit more, and vice versa. If you're training a bit more submaximally, you can probably do a bit more volume overall. But when it comes to training with high volumes and close to failure, necessarily increasing injury risk by much, I would love to see what research Jeff is relying on here, because to my knowledge, there is none. And in the studies we have, where people do 30, 40 sets per muscle per week, and they also train to failure, we don't really observe higher injury rates. So if anything, I would lean against this being true. And both the direct research and the practices of most bodybuilders support that a ton of hard training does seem to benefit growth. Additionally, a subgroup analysis by Pellin and colleagues did also find that even when participants were trained to failure, higher volumes still caused more growth. So it does absolutely seem like you can train both close to failure or to failure consistently with high volumes.
Low volume workouts, what happened? Did it work? Well, this is what I looked like at the beginning of the challenge. And this is what I look like now, after 100 days of low volume training. I was cutting during this experiment, so I am clearly leaner now, but I also think I look more jacked, especially in my legs and my shoulders. And despite being about 7 pounds lighter in the after, I think I held on to my muscle fullness, size, and density really well, and my DEXA supports that too. From day 1 to day 100, I lost 5.5 pounds of fat mass and 1.8 pounds of lean mass. I think that's a really solid ratio, especially when you consider that lean mass isn't only muscle mass. It also includes any water that I lost during the cut. And at my training age, you always lose some water as you shred down.
First of all, Jeff is looking absolutely amazing. Huge visual difference just from getting leaner, and he's looking amazing. However, this does completely confound any effect of the training approach. Not to mention there's not really a comparator or control like a Jeff 2.0 that is training with high volumes at the same time and finding better gains or worse gains. Secondly, I don't think the lean mass loss claim is categorically true. On average, I do think that as you lose weight, you will typically lose some lean mass even if true muscle loss hasn't occurred, because lean mass includes things like water and organ weight. But especially if you cut relatively slowly, you can definitely gain lean mass in a cut. I experienced this during my most recent cut. However, there is a good chance that was measurement error. And measurement error is kind of the big issue we have to deal with even for this video, so let's keep watching.
Even better than that implies, because throughout this challenge, I got 3 DEXA scans. One done on day 1, another on day 30, and a final check-in on day 100. From day 30 to day 100, so across 70 days of low-volume training, I actually gained half a pound of lean mass, while losing another 2.3 pounds of fat mass. That lean mass change could be within the margin of error, but it was still pretty encouraging to see.
Absolutely love that he brought up the margin of error, as that can make the difference between honest science communication and somewhat less honest science communication. In this case, a 0.5 pound difference is super likely to be noise. Is there a chance that he gained exactly 0.5 pounds of lean mass between day 30 and 100? Some small sliver of chance. But there's a whole range of possibilities here, from him gaining several pounds of muscle to him actually losing several pounds of muscle. Because a single DEXA scan comparison, a single individual, is going to carry a lot of measurement error. So yeah, absolutely love that he brought it up.
Also gained strength. Even in the very last week of my cut, when my macros were the lowest, I was hitting new PRs on the pendulum squat.
Yeah! 7! I did 5 reps with 5 plates 2 weeks ago. Yeah. 6 reps with 5 plates last week. 7 reps with 5 plates this week. Let's go. And my weight is going down. It's so insane how much better you lock in when you only have 2 sets to do. If I knew I had like 4 sets on that, I would be dragging my feet 100%. The fact I know I've only got 2, bro, I lock in and go crazy. Yeah.
And I even hit a huge new PR on the chest press machine in the final upper body workout of the experiment.
Dude, that's 3 reps. 4 reps. More than my previous PR. That's actually nuts.
Great job on emphasizing load tracking and even progression during a cut, because you can absolutely progress in a deficit. However, he is only talking about 2 specific exercises here, and strength is multifactorial. Slight changes in technique, practicing the movement more often, it being a new movement and therefore there being a greater component of neuromuscular improvement, changes to the muscle's architecture, things like the pronation angle, all of those can influence strength. So what I really love to see is just an average of all exercises performed during the cut and see whether on average that strength is maintaining. If it is, that's a super solid sign of muscle mass maintenance.
We also tested my max strength on the Smith machine bench press and the leg extension under a strict fasted protocol. After 100 days, I matched my bench press strength and I added 15 pounds to my leg extension max. That may not sound like much, but considering that I lost 7 pounds, I'm already very advanced, and I was actually doing really low volume compared to my baseline, I think that's super solid. And I'll link the raw data for the DEXA and my strength tests down below as well. I think my progress updates show a clear picture too. Much more definition in my lower half, more pop in my shoulders, and more shape in my arms. The biggest surprise for me though was just how good the workouts felt. This variable is becoming more and more important to me at 34 and almost 2 decades deep into training. Instead of dreading long workouts, now I actually can't wait to train each day. And this challenge did cause me to change my mind on something pretty big. If you've been following me for a while, you might remember that I used to say that your training volume shouldn't change just because you start cutting. How do training requirements change when you go from a caloric surplus to a caloric deficit? And I think the answer is actually quite simple. It doesn't. But after doing this challenge, I want to update that. If you're cutting, I think low volume is the way to go. High volume will still work, but I don't think it's ideal since your recovery is lower in a deficit and low volumes retain muscle just fine as long as you're training hard.
I miss the old Jeff Nippard, you know? Bring back the high volume, bro. On a serious note, I'm not a huge fan of the assumption that recovery is meaningfully lower without showing sources for this, especially in the context of a relatively modest deficit. Like if you're in a 500 calorie deficit, is your recovery really meaningfully going to differ? And ideally, we would have research on cutting and training volume directly, comparing lower volumes to higher volumes during a cut, finding which one retains muscle or even grows muscle better. But in the absence of that evidence, with this video, I think we're in the dangerous territory of theory crafting around why low volumes might be better, directly ignoring the largest data sets and what they say about training volume and hypertrophy. And if we had a super compelling rationale, a lot of mechanistic evidence to show that there is a compelling reason why lower volumes would work better in a deficit. But in the absence of that research, and with how much evidence we have on volume and hypertrophy, I disagree with Jeff. I think that you still want to do high volumes during a cut.
For bulking, I honestly think the best approach might be to keep your volume relatively low for every muscle except one. Blast one muscle with 10 to 20, maybe even 30 sets per week at a time. And then every few months, you can rotate which muscle you're blasting. I think this makes a lot of sense, especially as you get more advanced. And I think once I start a lean bulk again, this is probably what I'll do. And now that I've got the muscle lab, I'll make sure that I document all that progress and keep you guys posted on how it goes.
First off, absolutely agreed, specialization phases are great. Oftentimes for people with time constraints, it can allow them to really grow a muscle that they care about the most to its fullest, when they don't necessarily have the time or the energy or the motivation even to train everything at a high volume. And I do think that you can probably specialize on more than one muscle at a time. Here are my honest takeaways from this video, where I agree with Jeff on some and disagree with Jeff on some others. My first takeaway is that you can absolutely make gains on low volume training, especially if you take each set close to failure or beyond failure and treat it with intent. A second takeaway for you: it is likely that your volume requirements increase in a deficit. What do I mean by that? Well, to maintain muscle, you likely don't need 3 to 4 sets anymore. You likely need closer to 5 to 10 sets at minimum, depending on many things, like the size of your deficit, how much protein you're having, how good your genetics are, how long you've been lifting for, whether you're on steroids, how good your sleep is, how high your stress is, a ton of variables. But how many sets you need to do per muscle per week to maintain muscle and to grow muscle do likely increase. 3. It's likely that high volume is still better during a cut. Could you potentially maintain muscle with volumes as low as Jeff is recommending here? Yes, depending on many variables. But if you want your best chances at maintaining muscle or even gaining muscle, you very likely, based on the research we do have, want to do higher volumes than that. As a consequence of those two takeaways, you can still make gains in a cut. You maximize your chances of doing this with higher volumes. Point 5. If you're low on volume, time, motivation, can low volume work? Absolutely. But on a pure effectiveness basis, I think it's a mistake to say that it's better than high volume. What we still need to really figure out in the research is a few things. 1, is volume or intensity the real quote-unquote king of hypertrophy? Is there a combination of the two that's best? 2nd, figure out total recoverable volume for the whole body versus a muscle to at once, as most studies have been just focusing on 1 or 2 muscles at a time. 3, the moderating effect of a deficit on the relationship between volume and hypertrophy. 4, the effect of a modest deficit on recovery itself. Let me also give a few broad critiques of this video. 1, looking at single studies or even Jeff's N=1 experiment over the meta-analysis by Pell and colleagues or whoever else may not be that great. There's a reason the hierarchy of evidence exists. This is especially true when you're looking at an N=1 case study, though I will applaud Jeff that he does this way better than most people. He does a good job of using his case study to talk about the research overall. But still, when you're looking at how to train, pay attention to the hierarchy of evidence. 2, I think in the video there's sometimes some speculation passed off as fact or as being directly research-based. 3, I think ignoring a well-evidenced, large dataset relationship like the one between volume and hypertrophy, based on a few mechanistic rationales lacking direct support, is probably a step too far. But overall, I think this is a great video by Jeff, and it points out a few really solid use cases for low-volume training. It's a great thing to try if you're low on time or motivation. That's the video. If you would like to train smarter, consider trying MyoAdapt, my training app. MyoAdapt is a smart coach in your pocket. It adapts to your schedule, allows you to select your preferred muscle groups and your preferred exercises. It's directly based on the research, so your training will stay super effective for hypertrophy. Go to myoadapt.com and use code WOLF for a free 2-week trial so you can see whether or not you like it. Alternatively, if you would like me to coach you, you can book a free coaching call in the link below to see if you're a good fit. Finally, for any of the clothing I wear, including this compression shirt by Rascal, go to rascalapparel.com and use code WOLF at checkout for 10% off. That's the video. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.